Greetings everyone and welcome to Luan Ban Chin Su. Today we have extremely intense developments. Cuba is on fire, the Communist Party headquarters has been set ablaze, and the government is betraying its people. While 7 million citizens are writhing in darkness due to an energy crisis. A horrifying secret has been revealed. The regime has quietly sold off all its life-saving oil reserves to foreign countries to hoard foreign currency. Nicolas Maduro has been arrested. Cuban doctors are returning home in coffins, and now Havana is forced to kneel before Washington in search of a last chance for survival. Ukraine wiped out the Kremlin's technological weak point in a single terrifying night. More than 700 drones turned the sky into hell, exhausting Russia's air defenses so that the Storm Shadow missile could pierce through the brain of the world's largest missile chip manufacturing facility. From Voyager to Coimbra, shocking satellite images confirm that the entire chain of Russia's most advanced weaponry has been reduced to scrap, pushing Russia's war machine into a state of complete paralysis. The New World Order of 2026, collapsing authoritarian alliances and Donald Trump's iron fist. From the most devastating economic blockade in history against Cuba to destructive strikes reaching 1,300 kilometers deep into Russia, the world is witnessing the fall of an old era. As the last dominoes topple and superpowers lay their cards on the table, who will survive this terrifying geopolitical storm sweeping across the globe? Here are the details. Cuban Communist Party headquarters has fallen, and Russian and Iranian missile production systems have been destroyed. We are now entering the 11th consecutive day of protests in Cuba, and the situation on this island has officially fallen into a state of chaos. Now, we no longer just see people banging pots and pans in the dark to protest. Instead, we are witnessing the headquarters of the Communist Party being set on fire. And let me make this clear. That is not a metaphorical image. It's a harsh reality that's happening. Protesters in the city stormed local offices of the Communist Party. They dragged desks and chairs out into the street and set them all on fire. Security forces were at the scene, but they silently watched and did nothing. It's ironic when the same regime sentenced protesters to 22 years in prison back in 2021. Now they just stand still and watch their own headquarters engulfed in flames. Surely the security forces want to suppress these protests more than anything before they spread further. The truth is, if they could silence the streets overnight, they probably would have done it already. But the problem the government is facing now is much bigger. Compared to a few scattered protests this time, it's not just one angry neighborhood or one disappointed city. The anger is present everywhere. Since March 7th, protests have erupted almost simultaneously across the country. From Havana, Diego de Avila, Matanzas, to Santiago de Cuba. It all started with a breakdown at a power plant. On March 4th, a steam leak at the Antonio Guterres thermal power plant in Matanzas triggered a chain reaction, causing the power system to collapse across almost the entire island. Within just a few hours, about 80% of Cuba was plunged into darkness. That means around 7 million people were suddenly deprived of light and power. Entire residential areas were swallowed by darkness. Some areas were stuck in complete darkness for 51 consecutive hours. Even now, Cuba is entering its third consecutive week without electricity. Hospitals are struggling to hold on, running on backup generators that are also starting to dangerously run out of fuel. In Havana, bakeries feel like they've gone back in time. They have to bake bread using firewood, because there's simply no gas left to run the ovens. But here's the truth. That steam leak wasn't actually the cause of the crisis. It was just the last straw, exposing cracks that were already too deep. The real root of this tragedy lies in an agreement that two now-deceased dictators signed with each other a quarter of a century ago. To understand why Cuba has fallen into such a dire situation today, we have to go even further back in time, to the Cuban Revolution of 1959. But before we get into those details, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel below. That really means a lot to us. All right, now let's continue with the story. That revolution accomplished a lot of things that ordinary Cuban people truly supported. It brought free healthcare, universal education, and extensive land reforms for the rural poor, those who had been ignored under the previous regime. Also, with US backing, the new government created something like a real social contract with the state. Economically, an independent Cuba always stood on shaky ground. The island only produced sugar, a little tobacco, and nickel. That's all. Almost immediately after the revolution, everything got even harder. In 1960, the United States imposed a comprehensive trade embargo, cutting Cuba off from its largest market and closest trading partner. Suddenly, the island had to find a way to survive without the economic system that had been its pillar for so long. Cuba needed a lifeline, a powerful patron willing to keep its economy afloat, and they found just such a patron. The Soviet Union intervened right away. This agreement was simple, but extremely generous. Cuba would take a stand on one side, both politically and militarily, acting as the Soviet Union's outpost in the Western Hemisphere and promoting the idea that socialism could succeed in Latin America. In return, the Soviets would basically pour money into supporting the entire Cuban economy. They bought Cuban sugar at extremely high prices, sometimes 4 or 5 times the global market price, and sent cheap oil to the island, which Havana could re-export to earn hard currency. By the late 1980s, these subsidies had reached about $4.3 billion per year, equivalent to around 21% of Cuba's entire gross domestic product. This was a terrible level of dependence. Simply put, the Cuban economy at that time was like a parasitic organism, and the Soviet Union's aid was its lifeline. But then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The shock that followed for Cuba is still remembered as the special period, and it was truly devastating. From 1989 to 1993. Cuba's GDP collapsed by about 1/3. Both imports and exports dropped by more than 80%. And the oil tankers that used to supply the national power grid with fuel were reduced to just a fraction of what they used to be. The impact on daily life was extremely devastating. During the worst years of the crisis, the average Cuban lost about 9 kilograms just because there wasn't enough food. People ate whatever they could find. Sometimes it was things that had never been considered food before. The daily calorie intake dropped drastically, to the point that an article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal described it as famine in many parts of the country. Famine occurred in many regions of the country. Yet this regime still survived. It survived partly thanks to strict authoritarian control, but also due to some reluctant economic adjustments. The government legalized the use of the US dollar. They partially opened the economy to tourism and allowed small private businesses to operate within limited scope. These reforms stabilized the situation just enough to prevent a complete collapse. But they didn't solve the core problem. Cuba was still that same island with the old limitations. Very few natural resources, no domestic oil supply, and no powerful trading partner willing to subsidize its economy. But then in 1998, a former paratrooper named Hugo Chavez won the presidential election in Venezuela. For Cuba, this was like finding a second Soviet Union. Chavez was a man of strong convictions. Many years before that, in 1998, he tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government in a failed coup, which ended with him in prison. But his time in prison didn't break him. On the contrary, it only made his worldview even stronger. He spent those years reading political theory, studying revolutionary movements, and forming a vision for Latin America based on the ideals of Fidel Castro, a man he met and deeply admired. Fidel Castro immediately understood what he was dealing with. Hugo Chavez was not just an ordinary politician visiting Havana. He was a long-term ideological ally, someone who would control one of the richest, most oil-abundant countries on the planet. When Hugo Chavez visited Cuba in 1998, Fidel Castro treated him like a brother in the revolution. Castro even gave him a magnificent mansion in Havana, which had just been restored, to welcome Pope John Paul II with murals on the house and luxurious Italian marble floors. Soon after, this relationship quickly became deeper than a typical democratic alliance. When a group of Venezuelan officers overthrew Hugo Chavez in a brief coup in 2002, it was Fidel Castro who was one of the first leaders to call and urge him not to surrender, but to fight to regain power. Both countries clearly understood what they wanted from each other. Cuba was desperate for oil to survive, while Venezuela needed expertise and manpower that they were severely lacking. Therefore, in 2000, Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro signed one of the strangest economic agreements in the modern world. Venezuela began sending Cuba about 53,000 barrels of oil per day. Over time, that number climbed to around 90,000 to 100,000 barrels per day at its peak. And most of that was sold at a discount so deep it was unimaginable. This meant that Cuba didn't have to pay anything close to the world market price. In return, what Cuba sent was not cash, but people. Cuban doctors landed in the poorest neighborhoods of Venezuela through programs like Barrio Adentro, setting up clinics in communities that rarely saw the presence of a physician. At one point, more than 30,000 Cuban medical personnel were working diligently inside Venezuela. It didn't stop at healthcare. Cuba also sent teachers, sports coaches, and technical experts. And secretly, Havana also sent skilled intelligence advisors. These people worked closely with the Venezuelan leadership to help build part of the security and surveillance system. By the early 2010s, the lifeline from Venezuela had become enormous. This source of oil and economic support accounted for a huge proportion of Cuba's economy. Some years, support matched or exceeded what the island received from the Soviet Union during its golden age. The Cuban regime had become so accustomed to surviving on external aid that they never truly addressed the deep-rooted problems in their own economy. Instead of restructuring the system, modernizing infrastructure, or diversifying production, Havana simply relied on whoever was willing to help them keep the lights on. First the Soviet Union, then Venezuela. Those agreements were built on an extremely fragile assumption that Venezuela would always have surplus oil money to share. Then tragedy struck. In March 2013, Hugo Chavez died after a serious illness. His chosen successor, a former bus driver and union organizer named Nicolas Maduro, took power. And almost immediately, the foundations of Venezuela's economy began to show deep and devastating cracks. During Hugo Chavez's years in power, Venezuela basically built its entire economy around oil. This country once produced millions of barrels of oil daily and made a lot of money. But instead of using that money to maintain the oil wells, modernize the refineries, or strengthen the national oil company, most of the money was poured into social programs and political activities. So as long as oil prices stayed high, the system kept running smoothly. But by 2014, global oil prices plummeted uncontrollably, and Venezuela had absolutely no safety net. So the economy collapsed. Inflation spiraled into an endless loop that people couldn't even name anymore. At its worst point, Venezuela's annual inflation rate exceeded 1 million%. Supermarkets were empty. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine. Ordinary Venezuelans started losing a lot of weight simply because food became so scarce and expensive. Many studies later estimated that the average person lost between 5 to 10 kilograms during the darkest years of the crisis. People began fleeing their homeland. Not just thousands, but millions of people. More than 8 million Venezuelans have left the country during the years under Nicolas Maduro, creating the largest migration crisis in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, the very industry carrying the entire nation of Venezuela is also gradually collapsing. At the start of the Hugo Chavez era, the country produced around 3 million barrels of oil daily. But by the early 2020s, production had fallen below 700,000 barrels per day. That's a staggering drop of more than 75%. Years of poor management, sanctions, and lack of investment have hollowed out the oil industry from the inside. Skilled engineers and technicians have left the country, and machinery often breaks down without being repaired. Oil fields that once sustained one of the region's wealthiest countries now produce only a fraction of what they used to. That oil once gave Cuba a second life, but now it's disappearing little by little. Shipments to Cuba started to shrink, and then shrank even more. By 2019, Cuba was only receiving about 50,000 barrels a day, just half of what they used to depend on. And by the mid-2020s, the shipments became irregular to the point that the Cuban government had to start rolling blackouts, simply because they didn't have enough fuel to run the power plants. Russia tried to help, but they had to focus massive resources on the war in Ukraine and couldn't take on Cuba's energy bills as well. Mexico also helped fill part of the gap, at one point supplying up to 44% of Cuba's imported oil. But that support also had its limits. China looked at the numbers and decided that Cuba wasn't worth spending money on. for the first time since 1959. Cuba found itself in a situation it had almost never faced before. There was no patron left to rely on. And this is a detail that really made me angry. When I read an analysis by the US government that was shared with El Nuevo Herald, it showed that since the end of 2024, by the end of 2025, Cuba was actually still receiving about 70,000 barrels of oil per day from Venezuela. However, the government secretly resold about 40,000 of those barrels, which is about 60% to Asian customers, to earn hard currency. The Cuban government sold off the very fuel that was supposed to be for its own people on the world market, while their citizens had to sit in the dark. And then everything took a fateful turn. On January 3, 2026, U.S. forces arrested Nicolas Maduro. Almost overnight, the Venezuelan oil that Cuba had relied on for so many years stopped flowing completely. At the same time, another event occurred, one that was just as important as the oil itself. For many years, the Cuban government always insisted that they only sent civilians to Venezuela, from doctors and trainers to educators. But just one day after the U.S. raid, the newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party published a list of names and photos of 32 Cuban citizens who died in this operation. And according to that list, they were not doctors. They included officers from the Revolutionary Armed Forces and agents from the Ministry of the Interior who were said to have worked inside Nicolas Maduro's personal security team. This is not a small matter. The Cuban government has built its entire legitimacy on the story of sovereignty, about a small island managing its own destiny. But what the raid on January 3rd exposed in just one night was the bitter underside of that reality. This is the reason why, a few weeks later, on January 29th, 2026, President Donald Trump, Executive Order 14,380 allows tariffs to be imposed on any country that supplies oil to Cuba. The New York Times called this the first effective blockade of Cuba since the missile crisis years ago. Mexico immediately suspended shipments. Russia could not bear the risk from the tariffs, and Algeria also withdrew. Cuba's fuel supply has basically returned to zero. Now, Cuba has almost no other practical choice except to sit down at the negotiating table with Washington. Therefore, on March 13, 2026, President Mitsuda Canel appeared on Cuban national television and confirmed that his government began diplomatic talks with the United States. He described the discussions as respectful and focused on identifying the issues between the two countries in order to seek solutions. At the same time, Havana also announced the release of 51 political prisoners as a gesture of goodwill. Chairman Mitsuda Canel has been extremely cautious in his presentation. He has never stated exactly what Washington is requesting, and the Cuban government officially denies it, that any leadership change discussions have occurred. But there are rumors that the Donald Trump administration is pushing for a deal that requires Mitsuda Canel to resign. A White House official told reporters this week that Cuba is a country in decline and a deal with Washington would be very easy to make. The person leading the negotiations with the U.S. is Marco Rubio. Remember that Marco Rubio's family left Cuba after the revolution, and he has spent his entire political career arguing that the Cuban regime should never be allowed an easy way out. So if anyone in Havana is hoping that these negotiations will end with a polite handshake and a smooth exit for Mitsuda Canel, they may have misunderstood the opponent they're facing. But there's a bigger issue. Countries like Venezuela, even at their worst times, still have a certain political standing. They have elections and opposition leaders. Cuba doesn't have that. There are no opposition parties here, no competitive elections. There's no real legal way for citizens to challenge the government. And that's exactly what makes negotiations difficult and riskier than ever. The entire Russian and Iranian missile production line was wiped out in just one terrifying night. Ukraine launched a massive attack using drones and Storm Shadow missiles, executing the mission to destroy Russia's missile production. The massive scale of the attack, along with the complete helplessness of Russia's air defense system, created real shockwaves, as the rest of Russia's defense industrial base also had to endure thunderous blows. The most critical target in this campaign is the KMNI L-type brines microelectronics factory, one of Russia's largest semiconductor plants. The Ukrainian military used 7 Storm Shadow cruise missiles. 5 of them penetrated the main production plant. The other two hit auxiliary facilities, causing severe damage to the structure and industrial machinery. Satellite images have confirmed this devastating destruction, causing the plant to completely cease operations and fall into an irrecoverable state. Another painful proof of the absence of Russia's defensive network is that the attack was supported by a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone. In an unprecedented situation, this drone operated deep inside Russian territory, calmly designating targets and broadcasting live footage to the Ukrainian command, while the enemy was in chaos amid smoke and fire. Russia's missile production capability has now been completely paralyzed, as KMNL is the place where essential microelectronic components and semiconductors for a range of modern weapon systems are manufactured. To pave the way for this decisive strike, waves of drones were continuously launched towards the Vyazma region. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have detected and shot down 754 Ukrainian drones within just 24 hours, the highest number ever recorded in a single day. However, Ukraine's real objective was not to hit a specific target with these drones, but to exhaust and overload Russia's air defense system. They forced the opponent to expend a massive number of interceptor missiles, thereby clearing the way for Storm Shadow missiles to strike their targets. Notably, the plant in Benz is where chips for Pantsir air defense systems are made, cruise missiles and Iskander ballistic missiles, along with strategic missiles such as Karyzhar-59, Karyzhar-69, and Karyzhar-101. Not to mention radar systems, electronic warfare, and many other types of Russian drones. These chips are the brains that allow navigation systems, control, radar interface, and communication modules to operate securely. In air defense systems, they play a key role in processing radar signals, tracking targets, and electronic jamming. In the context of sanctions, with the West having cut off the supply of advanced semiconductors from abroad, domestic production at facilities like Kremlin has become vital for Russia to maintain its weapons output for the war. This is Russia's second-largest military microelectronics manufacturer, responsible for producing more than 1,200 different types of components. Destroying this factory would mean cutting off the domestic supply of high-tech components that Russia is craving more than ever. This seems to be the biggest blow in Ukraine's systematic campaign targeting Russia's defense industrial base. It didn't stop there. A large fire broke out at the Kosoguri metallurgical plant in Tula, with suspicions of a sabotage operation. Inside, this facility produces essential materials for manufacturing military equipment and armored vehicles. At the same time, Ukrainian drones also attacked the Cuba-Venezuela chemical plant in Tuliadi. The production workshops were engulfed in flames. After previous attacks, this plant produces chemical precursors that are extremely important for the ammunition industry. Russian factories that produce artillery shells, bombs, and missiles heavily depend on this chemical supply, making them weak links in the country's military supply chain. It didn't stop there. Ukrainian forces also carried out a daring long-range attack using kamikaze drones, targeting a chemical facility in Kurovochepsk. Located up to 1,300 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, the drones struck an ammonia and nitrate storage facility and destroyed the ammonia production unit. This stopped the whole production process. This facility belongs to the Udon Kim Group. The unit produces about 2.6 million tons of fertilizer each year and is among the top 10 fertilizer producers in Russia. On the Zhytomyr Peninsula, Ukrainian forces also carried out an attack on the Yevpatoria aircraft repair plant, a facility used by Russia to store and maintain the Rolfaport and Orion series. Satellite images show that 3 large warehouses were heavily damaged in this attack. These warehouses were originally used for helicopter maintenance, but later their function was converted to serve unmanned aerial vehicle systems. These relentless, precise, and calculated strikes not only destroy machinery, but are also suffocating the Russian war machine. This entire country is facing an unprecedented defense industry crisis in modern history. I wonder what Putin and the Russian people will think about these terrible developments.